In this episode of Introduction to Ethics, I'll talk about egoism. But first, let's go back to the question, should I have moral concerns? Plato, in his famous book Republic, talks about an imaginary ring that he calls the ring of Gyges. Whoever puts on this ring becomes invisible, and they can do whatever they like according to the story. But the question is, would you still have moral concerns if you could get away with any crime that you would commit when you have the ring on, when you have the ring of Gyges on, and when you're invisible? If you say yes, you would still have moral concerns, then you have to answer why you would still have moral concerns, because there will be no possibility to be caught when you have the ring that makes you invisible. When you commit these crimes, you can just get away with them because you'll not be visible by anybody. Nobody will see you committing the crime, so you can just get away with them. So if you say you'll still have moral concerns, you have to answer why. And depending on the answer that you give to this thought experiment, or to this question in the thought experiment, we have two closely related theories about morality. One of them is psychological egoism, and the other one is ethical egoism. According to psychological egoism, human beings cannot but act with self-interest. They can only act in a self-interested manner, and that's the only way they can behave. According to ethical egoism, on the other hand, although human beings have a capacity for altruistic behavior, for behavior that has other concerns, that concerns for other people, individuals have a duty to act with self-interest. Although they are capable of other concerning behavior, individuals have a duty to act out of self-interest, according to ethical egoism. So first, let me talk about psychological egoism. The major claim in this approach to morality says human beings are constituted by nature to pursue their self-interest. But we know that sometimes moral behavior requires us to act with altruistic motivations. Human beings cannot always act morally according to this second premise and the first premise. So the first premise says human beings are constituted by nature to act with self-interest, but the second premise says we know that moral behavior sometimes require human beings to act with altruistic motives, and therefore we reach the conclusion that human beings cannot always act morally. They can act morally only when what morality requires is in line with their self-interest, according to this conclusion. But look, such a moral code doesn't make sense if it cannot expect individuals to act in line with it, right? Hence, psychological egoism has to argue that morality is not possible. It's a type of moral nihilism in the framework that I'm giving it for the time being. Psychological egoism, having the name psychological in front of it, has to provide us certain scientific evidence for proving its stance. The psychological egoist premise is a strong one, and it needs certain evidence. Also, it would take just one counterexample to refute this premise, or maybe a statistically significant number of counterexamples. So, for instance, take someone who has donated one of their kidneys to a total stranger, and remember that Peter Singer gives one such example, a real case example. So this person seems to have a clear other concerning, or to put it in other words, altruistic motivations. The psychological egoist has to say that this person has ulterior motives, motives that they are not declaring themselves. Maybe an ulterior motive is having a fulfilling sense of doing good for others, according to psychological egoist. The kidney donor, on the other hand, can keep defending that their motivation is doing the right thing and not pursuing their self-interest. Now the psychological egoist has to change their theory from the donor has an ulterior motive to the donor must have an ulterior motive. Now the psychological egoist does not provide any more evidence to us, but rather already assumes the truth of their premise when they say they must have an ulterior motive that they are not declaring. So this is not a convincing evidence for psychological egoism. But have we rejected psychological egoism yet? The counter-arguments make it difficult to defend psychological egoism, but they do not refute it yet. So to refute, we need an argument to show that there are motives other than self-interest that motivate our actions, our moral actions. Let's go back to Ring of Gyges. Would you go to an old man's house and take his only savings, knowing that he has no other means of livelihood, just because this act is in your self-interest to do so? Many people would say no. And if you would not do this, we have to give an answer to why you would not do it. So one answer might be because they would feel bad about themselves afterwards. But would they feel bad about themselves afterwards because they're just brought up to believe that it's a bad type of behavior? Even though they believe that it's a bad type of behavior, we have to answer what makes this type of behavior a bad behavior. Or it might be because the suffering that you would create to the old man doesn't make up for the enjoyment or self-satisfaction or fulfillment of your self-interest that you get from this action. Or because you believe that the old man deserves better than this behavior and that's why you wouldn't do it. But in any case, self-interest falls short of distinguishing this behavior from another behavior in which no one gets hurt. So we still need morality involved in order to answer the question of why you would or you would not do such an action, and self-interest is not explanatory by itself. Let me talk a little bit about self-interest and evolution. So one supporting argument for psychological egoism claims that our genes are selfish. This is how individuals survive and pass their genes on, and it's part of evolutionary mechanisms. Individuals can get involved in altruistic or even self-sacrificing behavior only when it leads to greater preservation of their genes, according to this evolutionary theory. And evolutionary biology gives us different mechanisms to explain how this selfish gene behaves. These are kin altruism, group altruism, reciprocal altruism. You can check the details of these theories. But even if all this was true and our behavior was motivated somehow by self-interest, it's not still clear what type of behavior makes the best combination of short-term and long-term interests, or of narrow and wider interests. We still need a moral theory to lead us in the right direction. So psychological egoism would not be explaining why we behave the way we do. So I've just tried to explain what psychological egoism is saying, and then tried to give some counter arguments against it to reject psychological egoism, and came to the conclusion that even if psychological egoism was true, even if we cannot but act in our self-interest, this is not sufficient to direct us in our moral behavior. We need more than this. We need a moral theory. And this brings us to ethical egoism. The major claim of ethical egoism says following someone's self-interest is the right thing for them to do. So this time that this theory is not saying that we are constituted to follow our self-interest, but we ought to follow our self-interest. This is the morally right thing to do. This is what ethical egoism is saying. We should distinguish, even in this theory, between types of self-interest. We can talk about narrow self-interest, and this would include satisfying one's desires, getting what one wants, achieving success, etc. These are the types of interest that one seeks without direct concern for others. We can also have broader self-interest, and this would include doing good things for others apart from or as part of your self-interest. In order to find a balance between good for oneself and good for others, one still needs a moral theory. Ethical egoism is not explanatory at this point. We need further explanation and we need further ethical theories. Let me try to give one famous example that we might call ethical egoism. And the example is coming from Adam Smith, the famous economist Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, the famous theoretician of market economy, says economic agents act with the motivation of self-interest. The pursuit of self-interest of each agent leads to the collective common good. Hence the famous saying, private vices leads to public virtues. And defenders of capitalism say that this system captures the selfishness of human beings and makes us use it for the common good of the society. And on the other hand, critics of capitalism claim that this explanation of capitalism has a very limited function in the contemporary financial system. And think of the 2008 financial crisis. Bankers who sold credits to customers seeked only for their self-interest, which led to the collapse of a whole economic system. So what Adam Smith defended as a moral background for capitalism does not really explain the capitalist economy of today. We cannot use ethical egoism to understand or the motivation behind market economy today. Let me talk about general problems of ethical egoism. So it's morally acceptable to promote your own self-interests and build a meaningful and fulfilling life for yourself. Nobody denies this. But ethical egoism misses the point that major problem is how to reconcile one's self-interests with those of others. So everyone pursuing their self-interest can lead to social catastrophe, either in the form of some sort of war or a total collapse of a social system. So ethical egoism tells only one part of the story, and it misses the second part, and that's where we need ethical theories, other normative ethical theories. So in this episode, I've tried to refute psychological egoism as well as ethical egoism. And I'll talk about other normative ethical theories in the coming episodes.